He accidentally moved a painting just a tiny shift on the palace wall, but that single motion unleashed a storm the Queen had kept buried for years. Behind the frame, sealed with wax and trembling secrets, lay a hidden letter addressed to one name only, Charlotte. The moment he touched it, he knew this wasn't just a message. It was a confession powerful enough to fracture the royal family from the inside. And now the truth she never meant to be found was staring right back at him. The corridor was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, ancient, watchful and aware. Dust floated through a pale shaft of morning light that pierced the stained glass windows of Windsor's West Gallery. Beyond the hush of centuries, the faint tick of a clock echoed like a heartbeat restrained by duty. Edward Thorne walked carefully along the marble floor, each footstep measured, deliberate. He was the youngest curator ever assigned to the royal collection, a man more accustomed to the smell of varnish and parchment than to grandeur. But today, the air itself seemed heavier. Every step reminded him that these were not just paintings. They were witnesses, silent custodians of power and time. He paused before the portrait of Queen Alexandra. Painted in 1894, her eyes were softer than history usually allowed. The brushwork, delicate, English, immaculate, had always fascinated Edward. But this morning, something about it unsettled him. The frame, ever so slightly, was crooked. It was the kind of detail only someone like him would notice, a tilt barely perceptible, but enough to disturb the symmetry of the wall. Protocol was clear. No direct contact without senior authorization. Every artifact in the gallery was protected under layers of procedural reverence. Touching without permission was not only forbidden, it was sacrilege. Still, his hand hesitated in midair. The air felt colder here, closer to the wall, as if the painting exhaled its own faint breath. He swallowed, steadying himself. The inspection was due in less than an hour. If the chief curator saw that misalignment, questions would fall directly on him. And so, against the unspoken law of the gallery, Edward reached out. His gloved fingers met the gilt edge of the frame. The wood was colder than he expected unnaturally, so, as though the years within it had not yet thawed. He lifted slightly, adjusting the angle. The portrait gave a faint creak, and a soft puff of dust drifted downward like ash. Then came it a sound barely audible, yet distinct. A whisper of paper. A breath of air released from behind the frame. Edward froze. He leaned closer, listening. There a hollow space. The frame had concealed something. Carefully, he tilted the portrait forward. His pulse quickened. From the narrow cavity between the canvas and the backing board, something slid free. A small envelope yellowed with age, sealed in lavender wax. It fell lightly onto the carpet. Edward stared at it, motionless. The wax bore a faint impression, a crown surrounded by a wreath of roses. Not an official royal seal, but unmistakably personal. Below it, the faded ink read, "For Charlotte when the time is right." The handwriting was elegant, looping, old-fashioned, the kind only found in letters written with conviction. A chill ran through him. He knew what he was looking at could not exist without record. Every artifact, every letter within the royal collection, was catalogued, logged, and preserved by law. This, whatever it was not supposed to be here. His heart thudded in his chest as he glanced down the gallery. No one, just silence, portraits, and the soft hum of air through the vents. He knelt, lifting the envelope between gloved fingers. The paper was brittle, yet it carried a faint scent, lavender, unmistakable. A fragrance that belonged to another century. For a long moment, Edward simply stared. The weight of history pressed against him, whispering a warning. Protocol demanded immediate reporting. Discovery of unauthorized artifacts required sealed documentation, senior verification, and transfer to the Heritage Security Office. But the name Charlotte lingered like a ghost. He couldn't recall any official record of a Charlotte linked directly to Queen Alexandra. He exhaled slowly, torn between obedience and something far more human curiosity. The words of his training echoed in his mind. Curators do not interpret, they preserve. Yet the letter felt different. Personal, private, as if it had waited not to be preserved but to be found. He looked back at the portrait. The Queen's painted eyes met his, her expression calm and knowing. It was as though she were watching him choose. A faint creak broke the stillness, the gallery's far door shifting with the morning breeze. Edward flinched, almost dropping the envelope. Footsteps approached measured, clicking softly on the marble. Mr. Thorne, it was Mrs. Havers, the senior conservator Shah. Pied, efficient, unyielding. Her tone carried the effortless authority of someone who'd served the collection for 3 decades. Edward straightened instantly, concealing the envelope behind his inspection ledger. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, forcing calm into his voice. "His Majesty's inspection will begin at noon," she said, glancing around. "The West Gallery must be immaculate. You've completed the final assessment." He nodded too quickly. "Nearly, ma'am, just realigning one of the frames." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Realignment without order," he hesitated. "A single second too long." Her lips pressed together, the faintest sign of disapproval. "Be careful, Mr. Thorne. The gallery remembers everything." She turned, her heels clicking away, her words hanging in the air like a quiet threat. When she disappeared around the corner, Edward exhaled sharply. The echo of her warning lingered. The gallery remembers everything. He looked down at the envelope again. The lavender wax caught a glint of morning light, soft and solemn. He slipped it into his inner coat pocket, the motion deliberate but trembling. His conscience screamed against the act, but something deeper, some pulse of destiny or defiance, urged him on. The gallery returned to silence. As he turned back to the portrait, the faint scent of lavender still hung in the air. For an instant, he thought he saw the painting shift the slightest tilt, as if it had watched him hide what it once guarded. He blinked. The frame was still, the illusion past, yet unease stayed with him. He gathered his tools, recorded a final line in the maintenance log, frame inspected, alignment corrected, and closed the book, routine words masking the birth of a secret. As he walked toward the exit, the corridor stretched endlessly before him, portraits on either side, their painted eyes following him in solemn judgment. He could almost feel the envelope's weight against his chest, its presence louder than his own heartbeat. Outside, the winter air struck cold and sharp. Windsor's grounds were still, draped in fog. Bells tolled faintly from the chapel, marking the hour. Edward paused at the threshold of the gallery doors. Something inside him, guilt, fear, fascination, warred in silence. He looked back one last time. The Queen's portrait stood motionless in the dim light, regal and serene, and though he couldn't explain why, Edward thought he saw it just for a second tilt again. A whisper of old air brushed past him, like a breath escaping from behind time itself. He turned away, clutching his coat. The lavender scent followed. In that moment, he knew, though he couldn't yet name it, that something irreversible had begun. As Edward steps into the cold morning mist, the faint creak of the gallery doors fades behind him. But somewhere in the stillness, the portrait shifts once more, perfectly aligned one moment, and slightly askew the next, as though watching him leave. The fog had not lifted. It clung to the palace lawns like a ghost that refused to leave, swallowing sound and distance alike. Edward walked through it in silence, his breath visible, his thoughts louder than the bells still echoing faintly from St. George's Chapel. He'd intended to forget it, to log the find, to hand it over, to obey the rules that had shaped his life. But the moment he felt the letter's edge against his chest, logic began to dissolve. The lavender scent haunted him. It wasn't just fragrance, it was memory, presence, something human preserved by accident and will. By the time he reached his small office below the east wing, the fog outside had turned to drizzle, pattering gently against the high windows. The sound mixed with the low hum of the old radiator, giving the room the strange intimacy of a confessional. Edward removed his gloves, laid the envelope on the desk, and just looked at it. It seemed impossible that this fragile object had slept behind a royal portrait for more than a century, waiting, and that it had chosen him, of all people, to awaken it. His mind ran through every training lecture, every rule. Unauthorized handling of royal materials was a breach. Opening sealed correspondence without clearance could result in dismissal and worse. But this wasn't just a letter. The wax, the handwriting, the deliberate concealment, none of it belonged to official documentation. This was private, personal, meant to be hidden. He reached for his magnifying glass, his hands trembling slightly. The wax seal bore minute cracks lines that shimmered like old scars. At its center, the faint crown mark was unmistakable. His heart slowed. The reality of what he held began to sink in. This was hers, Queen Alexandra, her touch, her words, her final privacy. Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the envelope as though it might speak. A thought came unbidden, dangerous, persistent. What if this was never meant for history, but for someone forgotten by it? He rose abruptly, pacing the narrow room. Outside, rain thickened. The smell of damp stone filled the air. Every instinct urged restraint. Yet every second he waited made the pull stronger. The envelope seemed to whisper his name now, not in words, but in invitation. He sat again. His fingers hovered above the wax. A single press would shatter more than a seal. He took a slow breath, just to see. He whispered to no one, and then he broke it. The faint snap of the wax filled the room like a gunshot in a cathedral. He froze, listening, but only rain answered. Carefully, he unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had browned with age, but the words were still clear, steady, graceful. The first line stole his breath. My dearest Charlotte, should this letter ever find you, know that it carries my heart, not my title. He read it again, slower this time. The phrasing was unmistakably that of Queen Alexandra, her formal restraint softened by maternal affection. Each sentence carried both weight and tenderness, regret for silence, gratitude for love unspoken, and an undercurrent of secrecy too deliberate to ignore. They will not let me speak your name in rooms where power sleeps, but know that I have given you a gift that no decree can erase the right to know that you were loved. Edward's breath caught. The implications struck like thunder. The Queen, addressing a Charlotte, with words of intimate affection. It sounded not like correspondence between monarch and subject, but between mother and child. He kept reading. If ever the time becomes right, there is a trust sealed and hidden that bears your name, though not upon the record. It will be guarded by those who remember, and if no one does, then let this letter be remembrance enough. Edward's pulse quickened. A trust, a hidden inheritance, and a person, Charlotte, who, by all known accounts, did not exist. He could feel history shifting beneath his feet. The rest of the letter was brief, a mother's benediction written in a hand, both regal and trembling. And at the bottom, her signature, Alexandra R. He stared at it until his vision blurred. Outside, the rain intensified, smearing the faint reflection of the window pane. The moment felt both sacred and dangerous, like trespassing inside a prayer. Then a knock, soft, hesitant. Edward jolted upright, sweeping the letter back into its envelope, pressing it beneath an open ledger. "Come in," he said quickly. The door creaked open. It was Henry Blackwell, one of the senior attendants. Kind man, quiet, observant. He carried a tray with tea and a small envelope of inventory forms. Long morning. Henry smiled faintly, setting the tray down. They say the king's private secretary is already pacing the east corridor. Inspections always turn everyone inside out. Edward nodded absently, hiding his tension, just keeping ahead of things. Henry glanced at the papers on the desk, at the ledger's awkward placement. "You all right, lad?" Edward forced a smile. just tired eyes. Henry studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged gently. "Careful not to lose yourself in those relics. Some of them have more life than we do." He left the room with a polite nod, the door closing softly behind him. Edward exhaled, waiting until his pulse steadied. Then he retrieved the letter, holding it like contraband. The reality struck him again. He'd crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But beneath that fear was something else, a strange, growing sense of responsibility. This letter wasn't theft. It was stewardship of truth that had been silenced. He turned toward the narrow filing cabinet in the corner, unlocked it, and withdrew an old archival folder unmarked, unused. He slipped the letter inside, added 2 sheets of clean parchment, and locked it again. It wasn't much protection, but it was a start. He returned to his desk, staring at the portrait's printed catalogue entry. The page described Queen Alexandra's painting, its provenance, its restorations, but there was no mention of any modification to the frame, no concealed compartment. That meant someone had placed the letter there intentionally. Someone who knew it would remain hidden and trusted that the portrait, like the monarch herself, would never be disturbed. Edward rubbed his temple, mind racing. How many hands had maintained that portrait in a century? Dozens, hundreds, and yet no one had found it, unless he thought someone had and chosen to hide it again. The thought chilled him. He looked up at the rain-laced window. The castle grounds beyond were blurred and grey, their statues halves, wallowed by mist. A flash of movement caught his eye, a reflection, faint but unmistakable. Someone passing in the corridor outside his office. Then, pausing, he couldn't see their face, but he saw the shadow linger a moment longer than chance would allow. Then it moved on. He stood there listening, nothing, only the echo of his own breath. He sat slowly, hands clasped together. The walls of Windsor had ears, he'd been warned of that. Every misplaced word, every irregular action found its way to the upper offices. And now he'd given them reason to listen. He reached for the envelope again, but stopped. The lavender scent was fading. He realized he'd held his breath the entire time he'd been reading, afraid to disturb it. Edward leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. For the first time in his life, history felt alive, not as something recorded, but as something breathing through him. And yet, the weight of what he'd done pressed deeper. His discovery, his theft, if one dared call it, that would not remain unseen for long. Gallery inspections left trails, and trails led to questions. He would have to choose, soon, confession or concealment. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, startling him. He turned toward the sound, but what he saw wasn't outside. It was on the wall opposite, above his desk, a framed reproduction of the very same portrait, Queen Alexandra's face staring out, serene, her gaze fixed somewhere past him. For a second, in the dim light, he could have sworn she was looking at him directly. He blinked. The illusion dissolved, leaving only canvas and shadow. Edward closed his eyes, letting the quiet sink in. Then, almost mechanically, he whispered the words he had read. "My dearest Charlotte, when the time is right." The phrase lingered on his tongue like confession. When the time is right. He didn't yet know what that meant or why it felt like a promise. But he knew one thing: the time was no longer sleeping. The past had begun to stir. He folded the letter back into the folder, locked it once more, and slipped the key into his pocket. Then he extinguished the desk lamp. The room fell into shadow, soft, uncertain, breathing. Outside, the rain finally stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then, faintly, from the distant corridor, the sound of slow footsteps returning toward the gallery. Measured, deliberate. Edward froze, listening as they passed. They didn't stop, but the echo of them carried something heavy, like the sound of duty awakening. He knew it then. The gallery would not stay quiet. The discovery would ripple outward quietly, invisibly, through archives, through whispers, through eyes that watched every key and motion within these walls. And when they came asking what he had found, He would have to decide whether to protect history or the truth that history had buried. He sat back, staring at the darkened window where the castle's silhouette faded into mist. A single candle flickered on his desk, its flame bending toward the drawer where the letter lay hidden. The air still carried the faintest scent of lavender. As the night deepens over Windsor, the camera drifts back through the corridors toward the Queen's portrait in the West Gallery. For an instant, in the shimmer of candlelight, her painted eyes seem alive again. And behind the gilt frame, a breath of cold air escapes like a sigh from a century that refused to stay buried. The morning after the discovery arrived cold and unwelcoming. Mist still rolled over the lawns of Windsor, but inside the castle the silence had changed. It no longer felt like peace, it felt like watching. Edward Thorne sat at his desk, sleepless, staring at the folder locked inside his drawer. He hadn't dared take it home. The idea alone felt absurd, carrying a Queen's hidden letter through the city on a commuter train. So instead, he had stayed through the night, cataloguing nothing, thinking of everything. The lavender scent was still faint in the air, a ghost that refused to leave him. Down the corridor, voices began to stir. Clerks arriving early, conservators unlocking cabinets, the ordinary rhythm of royal routine, yet every sound seemed sharper now, every step heavier. Edward straightened his collar, opened his ledger, and tried to appear as though the night had never happened. But the moment he heard his name called Mr. Thorne, his stomach turned. Lady Eleanor Kent stood in the doorway. Tall, impeccably dressed, and known for her calm authority, she was the chief curator of the royal collection and the one person whose gaze could strip any pretense of composure. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, rising too quickly. She offered a polite nod, stepping inside. "I trust the West Gallery inspection went smoothly yesterday." "Yes, ma'am," he said, "all accounted for." She glanced around the office, eyes moving over the ledgers, the neatly stacked notes, the faint trace of dust still on the carpet. Then her attention returned to him. "There's been a report. A minor discrepancy in the gallery logbook, nothing serious, I'm sure. But the entry for the Queen Alexandra portrait is missing the restoration code." Edward froze. He remembered the line he'd written hastily. Frame inspected. Alignment corrected. He had omitted the code that would confirm authorization. "Perhaps I overlooked it," he said softly. Her voice remained even, but her gaze sharpened. "That's unlike you, Mr. Thorne." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll amend it immediately." "Please do." She paused, studying him longer than necessary. Then, with faint courtesy, "The inspection team will recheck the gallery at noon. Make sure everything is as it should be." When she left, the room felt colder. Edward sat slowly, heart pounding. The machinery had begun to turn. Even the smallest anomaly in the records could draw attention. Every frame, every brushstroke was under quiet surveillance, not for beauty, but for control. He turned the key in the drawer, retrieving the folder. The letter remained where he'd left it, the wax broken cleanly through its crown. He read it again, slower this time, searching for details. Each word, each stroke of ink seemed to whisper meaning he hadn't yet caught. "There is a trust sealed and hidden that bears your name, though not upon the record." He traced the phrase with his eyes. A trust. It sounded financial, but its secrecy made it something else: legacy, inheritance, or confession. He thought of the Supplementary Heritage Register, a classified catalogue within the Royal Archives, known only to senior curators, a record of artifacts too sensitive for public documentation. If anything bore the mark of secrecy, it would be there. But access required clearance, and he had none. Still, curiosity began to blur the edges of fear. He rose, putting on his coat. His breath left a pale mist in the corridor's chill. The footsteps of others echoed faintly, archivists beginning their day, guards passing on rounds. The Royal Archives lay beneath the castle's eastern wing, a labyrinth of stone chambers lined with iron doors and the hum of temperature control. Access was logged by key and code, every motion recorded. Edward descended the spiral stairs, his footsteps steady but quick. He told himself it was simple, a routine verification. No one would question a curator consulting archival entries before inspection day. At the entrance, the archivist on duty, a quiet man named Finch, greeted him with a nod. "Morning, Thorn, early start, inspection day." Edward replied, "Need to double. Check a few register entries before the team comes through." Finch barely looked up, recording the visit in the logbook. "Keep it brief, they're testing the dehumidifiers at 11. Edward signed, passed through the reinforced door, and entered the lower chamber. The air was dry, cool, a precise chill that smelled faintly of parchment and metal. Rows of cabinets stretched into the dimness, their brass handles gleaming. Each drawer carried a code, each code a lineage. He walked slowly, tracing his fingers across the etched numbers. Then he found it Register S12, Supplementary Heritage. Restricted, his breath hitched. The small brass keyhole gleamed like an unblinking eye. He knew he shouldn't, but something within him, the same compulsion that had driven him to touch the portrait, refused to yield. From his pocket he withdrew a ring of access keys, none of which were meant for this lock. He tried the first, no click; the second, nothing; the third, a soft turn. The drawer slid open with a sigh of air. Inside lay rows of aged folders, each marked by a single emblem rather than a name, an iris, a crown, a cross, and near the end one marked by a lavender rose. His pulse raced. He drew it out carefully. The folder was thin, nearly weightless. Inside, a single card, handwritten, formal, faded with time. Supplementary Heritage entry #441, confidential bequest, sealed under order of council, 1903. Recipient, Charlotte. Documentation withheld under royal privacy decree, classified indefinite. Edward stared at it. There it was, confirmation, proof that the letter spoke truth. Charlotte existed at least once, at least in secrecy. He scanned the margin, a notation in pencil. Refer crossfile 441A, lavender. Destroyed 1953. Destroyed, so the trust, whatever it was, had been erased from the record 70 years ago. A hollow feeling filled his chest, the kind that comes when knowledge reveals not enlightenment, but loss. He closed the folder gently, replaced it, locked the drawer, and stepped back. For a moment, he stood in the dim corridor of the archives, feeling the weight of the air around him, as though the very stones of Windsor disapproved. When he turned to leave, Finch was already there. "Thought you were gone," the archivist said, his voice neutral but edged with curiosity. "Everything in order?" Edward forced a nod. "Yes, just a cross-check on an entry from 1903. "Which one?" "Portrait registry, nothing significant." Finch's eyes narrowed faintly. "You went into the restricted drawer." Edward hesitated. The archivist's voice dropped. "Be careful what you open, Thorn. Some of those entries were sealed for a reason." Then, without waiting for reply, Finch turned away, his footsteps fading into the echoing hall. Edward's heart pounded as he made his way back toward daylight. He emerged into the East Wing corridor just as a group of attendants passed by, carrying inspection forms and linen gloves. Their laughter was light, but behind it he felt something heavier, the normalcy of people unaware that history had just shifted beneath them. Back in his office, he locked the door, sat, and closed his eyes. The name Charlotte no longer floated in mystery. It was inked in official record, erased later, but never forgotten by the archive. He pulled the letter from its folder once more, reading it now with new understanding. "It will be guarded by those who remember." Those words weren't poetic. They were literal. Someone had guarded this secret for generations, archivists, curators, attendants perhaps all unknowingly serving a chain of remembrance that led to him. He looked again at the Queen's handwriting, at the tenderness hidden beneath royal restraint. What could have driven her to write this, to hide it? A faint knock startled him. Mr. Thorne. It was a junior clerk, timid, carrying a sealed memorandum. From Lady Kent, the clerk said. She requests your presence in the West Gallery at noon. Edward accepted the note with a stiff nod. Thank you. The door closed again, leaving him alone with the ticking of the clock. Noon, the re-inspection. He rose, straightened his cuffs, and glanced once more at the letter. For a moment, he considered taking it with him, hiding it somewhere safer. But that would mean another theft, another step into the shadows. Instead, he placed it back in the folder, locked the drawer, and pocketed the key. Outside, the corridors were alive again, bustling, controlled, expectant. He moved through them like a ghost, unseen amid the ritual of routine. When he reached the West Gallery, Lady Elena was already there. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting the marble floors in shards of gold. Assistants checked frames, noted inventory numbers, adjusted lighting angles. Elena stood near the Queen's portrait, her gloved hands folded, her eyes on the painting. Mr. Thorne, she said without turning, you realigned this frame yesterday? Yes, ma'am. By what authority? He hesitated. The frame was misaligned by less than an inch. I corrected it for presentation. Her gaze finally met his. It was not angry, it was searching. Protocol exists for a reason. She said quietly, the royal portraits are sensitive. I understand, ma'am. Do you? She asked. Then, more softly, when you touched this frame, did anything seem unusual? His breath caught. Unusual, yes. She stepped closer to the painting, her voice lowering. A loose hinge, a hollow space, anything that might require attention. Edward stared at the portrait. The Queen's painted eyes met his once more, calm and knowing, as they had before. No, ma'am, he said finally, nothing unusual. Elena held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Very well. She turned to the assistants. Carry on. The inspection resumed, measured, silent, methodical. Yet beneath the surface calm, Edward could feel the weight of suspicion shifting like unseen current. Every glance felt longer than necessary. Every whisper seemed directed his way. When it was done, Elena dismissed the team and lingered alone by the portrait. Edward started to leave, but her voice stopped him. Mr. Thorne. He turned. She looked at him, not stern now, but curious. You remind me of my grandmother, she said unexpectedly. She worked here once, under Alexandra's household. Edward blinked. Truly, yes. She used to say the Queen's eyes followed her everywhere, that the portraits had secrets. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. I never believed her, not until today. Before he could respond, she turned away, signaling the end of conversation. Edward walked out slowly, the echo of her words trailing him. Not until today. He felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to shift again, as if others, too, could sense what had awakened. By the time he returned to his office, the sky had darkened, rain clouds gathering once more above the castle towers. He sat, unlocked the drawer, and stared at the letter. His reflection glimmered faintly in the window behind it, a man who had crossed from preservation into trespass. And yet, something deeper whispered within him. Perhaps the trespass had always been part of the duty. He lifted the envelope again, tracing the lavender seal's broken edge. The Queen's words seemed to breathe through the silence. When the time is right. Edward knew whatever time she had meant, it had begun. As rain begins to fall again over Windsor's grey rooftops, Edward's fingers linger on the lavender seal, and in the flicker of afternoon light, he notices a pattern embossed within the wax itself, the faint impression of an archival code. The same code recorded only in one place, the forbidden supplementary heritage register. The rain had deepened into a steady rhythm by dusk, tapping against the high glass panes of the west corridor like a patient metronome. Windsor had quieted again, but the silence no longer comforted Edward Thorne. It pressed against him, dense and deliberate, as if the walls themselves were thinking. He sat beneath the low light of his office lamp, the letter spread open once more across his desk. That faint archival code impressed within the lavender wax haunted him now, a circular pattern of tiny letters barely visible under angled light. He adjusted his magnifying lens. The inscription read, SHR/441. The same entry he had found in the restricted drawer that morning. The connection was no longer coincidence, it was confirmation. Queen Alexandra's personal seal carried the registry code of an artifact deliberately hidden within the Supplementary Heritage Register. That meant the concealment wasn't accidental. It had been orchestrated. He exhaled, leaning back, the leather chair creaking beneath him. The letter was not just a mother's confession. It was a map. But a map to what? He turned the page over. No secondary markings, no date. Only a faint watermark, Crown Linen and Co., 1903. Standard stationery of the royal household. But the scent, the lavender, still persisted faintly in the folds. He sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the ink as if waiting for it to move. The day's inspection replayed in his mind Lady Elena's questions, her grandmother's mention, the glint in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she said. He thought again of Finch, the archivist, warning him to be careful. Some of those entries were sealed for a reason. Reason or fear. The difference, Edward realized, was often written by whoever held authority. A soft vibration on his desk interrupted the thought, a message from the internal telegraph line. Lady Kent requests your presence. Archive Hall, 2000, 8 o'clock, after hours. He stared at the note. Such requests were rare, unheard of, even. The archive hall closed at 6. He rose, straightened his jacket, and slipped the letter back into its folder. The key turned softly in the drawer, the sound oddly final. The corridors were dim now, lit only by low amber sconces. The air carried the faint metallic scent of rain seeping through the stone. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way toward the lower wing. At the archive hall, the door was ajar. Lady Elena stood inside, illuminated by a single reading lamp that cast long shadows across the old ledgers. She didn't turn when he entered. Close the door, Mr. Thorne. He obeyed, the latch clicking into silence. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the dehumidifiers and the whisper of rain above them. Then she said quietly, I believe you found something. Edward's throat tightened. I am not sure what you mean, ma'am. Her eyes lifted from the table. They were calm but unyielding. Don't insult both of us. The portrait of Queen Alexandra hasn't been moved since 1974. And yet, yesterday you logged a frame correction, no code, no authorization. And today, the inspection notes include a faint mark on the ledger, lavender ink, not yours. Edward said nothing. The truth sat like a stone in his chest. Elena walked toward him slowly, her heels quiet on the marble floor. Do you know what happens to curators who interfere with archival material? He swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Then tell me why you did it. For the first time, Edward met her gaze fully, because it was wrong to leave it hidden. She stopped. What was? He hesitated. The decision was instantaneous, irrational, perhaps, but inevitable. He reached into his coat, withdrew the folder, and placed it gently on the table. Elena looked down at it, her face unreadable. What is this? Something that was never meant to be found, he said. She studied the lavender seal, the broken wax, the Queen's handwriting visible through the thin fold. For a moment, all authority left her face. What remained was something else, familiarity. She whispered, I've seen that crest before. Edward watched her trace the seal lightly with her gloved finger. Where, in my grandmother's diary, she murmured, she was a governess to one of the Queen's private wards. The child's name was Charlotte. No title, no surname. She vanished from the household in 1904. Edward's pulse quickened. You knew, not knew, she said softly, only suspected. My grandmother was discreet, the royal code of silence. But she wrote once, In a letter I wasn't supposed to read. The queen wept for the daughter the crown could not acknowledge. Silence filled the hall. The hum of the lamps deepened, blending with the rain. Elena looked up at him again. You understand what you've done by taking this. I've preserved what history chose to forget. Her eyes softened. Or unearthed what was buried to protect the living. Edward said nothing. The letter between them seemed to radiate its own quiet light, fragile, defiant, human. Elena sighed, pulling a chair closer. Sit, Mr. Thorne. He obeyed. She opened the folder, scanning the letter carefully. Her face shifted through disbelief, recognition, sorrow. This handwriting. There's no doubt. She whispered, it's hers. Queen Alexandra, yes. Her voice steadied. And this code SHR/441, that's the Supplementary Heritage Register entry, destroyed in 1953. Edward nodded, not destroyed, misfiled. It still exists, I saw it this morning. Her gaze snapped up. You accessed the restricted register? Yes. A pause. Then quietly, you're either remarkably foolish or remarkably brave. He didn't respond. Elena folded her hands atop the table. Listen carefully. What you hold here, if verified, does more than expose a private grief. It challenges the recorded line of succession, even if only symbolically. Edward frowned. Symbolically, the monarchy doesn't survive by blood alone, she said. It survives by story, by the narrative of continuity. You break that, even in whisper, and everything begins to tremble. He absorbed her words slowly. Then what do we do? She looked at him for a long moment. Then, deliberately, she closed the folder. We keep it between us, for now. Edward blinked, but, until we understand its context, she interrupted. If this letter is genuine, it belongs neither to the public nor the archives. It belongs to truth, and truth is delicate. He leaned forward. You're not going to report me. Elena's lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained grave. You think I haven't found things I wasn't meant to. The faintest hint of weariness entered her tone. The crown's history is written in omissions. We are caretakers of those omissions. She stood, walking to the far wall where an antique filing case stood locked. From it, she withdrew a small binder, aged, unmarked. Every curator keeps one, she said. Private notes, fragments the official ledgers would rather forget. She opened it. Inside were sketches, copied transcriptions, faded photographs, personal archives of forgotten truths. She slid the folder beside them, aligning it precisely. For now, it stays here. Edward rose. With respect, ma'am, you'll hide it again. Protect it. She corrected. If you're wise, you'll forget you ever saw it. He hesitated. Can you? She looked at him, and for the first time her expression carried something like pain. No, but that's the burden of our work. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the Berkshire Hills. Elena returned the binder to its case, locking it with quiet finality. The sound echoed in the stillness. Go home, Mr. Thorne, she said. Sleep, if you can. Tomorrow we continue as though nothing has changed. But both knew everything had. Edward lingered a moment, unsure if gratitude or fear dominated his heart. Then he nodded, turned, and left the hall. The corridor outside was darker now, lit only by distant sconces. His reflection followed him in each pane of glass, pale, uncertain, haunted. He reached his office, but he didn't go in. Instead, he walked past it, through the service corridor, to the West Gallery once more. The guards were gone, the lights dimmed, the portraits watched in silence. He stopped before Queen Alexandra's painting. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, what did you want her to know? No answer came, only the faint creak of old canvas settling in its frame. He imagined the Queen writing that letter alone, by candlelight, sealing it with lavender wax, not as a mark of power, but as an act of tenderness, a secret between mother and child, hidden behind her own image. Duty versus love, protocol versus truth, the two forces that built and broke empires, now reduced to paper and scent. Edward's reflection stared back at him through the glass. His face looked older already, etched by something heavier than time. Behind him, thunder murmured again. The storm had deepened, drumming softly against the stained glass windows. He turned to leave, but something caught his eye, the faintest movement in the corner of the frame. A reflection, perhaps, or a shadow. He stepped closer. There, on the lower gilt edge, barely visible, was an engraving, a small crown and rose, identical to the seal. He brushed the dust gently aside, and beneath it, a date emerged, 1903. The year the letter was written. His pulse quickened. This wasn't random placement. The portrait itself had been chosen as a vault. He whispered to himself, she hid it in her own likeness. The realization carried both awe and sorrow. The Queen had not trusted her advisers, her court, nor her family, only her painted reflection, eternal and silent. He took one last look before stepping back into the corridor. Behind him, the rain fell harder, a muted applause of secrecy preserved. And somewhere deep in the archive vaults, Lady Elena stood before the locked cabinet, her hand resting on the key, her thoughts far from duty. She looked down at the binder once more, at the letter, sealed in lavender, and whispered to the empty room, "Forgive us for remembering." As dawn approaches, the castle lies under a blanket of mist once again. Edward walks away from the gallery, unaware that his visit has already been logged by unseen eyes in the security records. And in a quiet office across the courtyard, the Royal Household's Preservation and Heritage Security Division begins reviewing an alert. Unauthorized after hours access West Gallery. The first light of dawn fell unevenly across Windsor's West Gallery, breaking through high dust, streaked windows like a reluctant confession. Edward Thorne moved quietly along the marble floor, his steps careful, precise, as though the polished stone could betray him. The lavender scent lingered faintly, now mingled with the cold tang of early morning air. He carried the folder under his arm, his pulse still echoing the weight of yesterday's discoveries. He paused at the Queen Alexandra portrait. Her painted eyes caught the first rays, reflecting a gaze that seemed almost sentient, aware of the secrets hidden just beyond the canvas. The memory of the letter's words pressed against him. "They will not let me speak your name in rooms where power sleeps." Rooms where power slept. Rooms where truths were silenced and lives erased. Edward exhaled. He knew the implications of that line more clearly now. Charlotte, a name buried by protocol, by law, and by fear. He retraced his steps to the archives, taking care to avoid the paths that security cameras most frequented. Every shadow seemed elongated this morning, each sound amplified. The distant clatter of a maid's broom, the echo of boots in the northern corridor. Inside the archive hall, the folders of the Supplementary Heritage Register waited like ghosts. The lavender, sealed entry hash 441 lay at the center of it all. He opened it again, reading the cross. Referenced notes, Charlotte, confidential bequest, not recorded, destroyed 1953. Guardian unknown. He exhaled, destroyed yet remembered. It was impossible to ignore. Somewhere, someone had kept this memory alive. A curator, a governess, perhaps even a member of the household staff who refused to speak, a silent witness to a truth carefully erased. Edward flipped through the folder again, noticing an annotation in pencil he hadn't seen before. Verify Charlotte's existence against household records, contact only if essential. His heartbeat quickened. This was more than archival curiosity. This was an unrecorded lineage, an unacknowledged heir to Queen Alexandra herself. He stood, pacing the narrow office, the moral weight of what he held pressed down, not as obligation, but as urgency. To ignore it would be to betray history. To reveal it could append centuries of careful preservation, of royal narrative. His mind drifted back to Lady Elena Kent. She had knowledge beyond her position, a quiet connection to this hidden line. Her grandmother, once governess to Charlotte, had kept records, diaries, and letters. Elena had mentioned them yesterday, in fragments, careful not to disclose too much. Edward realized that she, like him, had been entrusted with fragments of a story too dangerous to tell openly. The thought made him shiver. History was rarely kind to those who uncovered what it had chosen to erase. Hours later, he found himself seated across from Elena in her office. She gestured for him to sit, and for a long moment neither spoke. "Do you understand what you've uncovered?" she asked finally. Her voice was calm but layered with caution. Edward nodded slowly. A child, a granddaughter, Queen Alexandra's granddaughter, hidden, erased from all records. Elena's eyes softened with something between sorrow and recognition. "Yes, Charlotte." He blinked. "But why? Why hide her?" She hesitated. "The monarchy cannot survive every truth. There are decisions made for stability, continuity, and sometimes for appearances. A royal lineage, when challenged by whispers of unacknowledged heirs, can falter." Edward absorbed this in silence. The weight of centuries seemed to settle into the room. Every corner, every stack of ledgers, every shadow spoke of secrets too long preserved. "And the letters," he said finally. "The ones I've found, are they the only records?" Elena shook her head. "No, there were more. Correspondence, journals, notes. Some destroyed, some hidden. My grandmother kept a few, discreetly. Enough to know Charlotte existed. Enough to pass on fragments to me." Edward's pulse quickened. "Then the Queen Alexandra intended for Charlotte to be acknowledged eventually. Perhaps," Elena said softly, "or perhaps she merely hoped that someone would remember her." The room fell silent again. The ticking of a distant clock became a drumbeat, measuring the distance between revelation and consequence. Edward rose and walked to the window. Outside, Windsor's grounds were cloaked in mist, grey and indistinct. He could almost imagine Charlotte running there as a child, unseen, unacknowledged, her life lived in shadows. Elena followed, her voice breaking the quiet. "You must understand, if this information were to be exposed, it could trigger more than scandal. The royal household would move to suppress it immediately." Edward turned to her. "But keeping it hidden after all this, doesn't that make us complicit?" Elena's eyes met his. "History demands discretion. Sometimes protection is more honorable than exposure. The crown survives through loyalty, even when that loyalty is painful." He absorbed her words. The tension between truth and duty pressed on him like a physical weight. For a moment, he considered placing the letters back behind the portrait, as if returning them could absolve him. But the envelope's lavender seal seemed to mock the thought, defiant, delicate, insistent. Then came a knock. Edward froze. Lady Elena's hand subtly rested on the folder. "Enter," she said. The door opened, revealing Lord Pembroke. The royal comptroller, a tall man with sharp features, measured voice, and eyes that missed nothing. His presence carried authority, menace, and the unmistakable air of someone who managed consequences before they arrived. "Good morning," he said, his gaze sweeping the office. "I hear we have a matter of some historical interest." Elena did not answer immediately. Her lips pressed together, a subtle signal to Edward. "Mr. Thorne," Lord Pembroke continued, "I understand there has been some interaction with the Queen Alexandra portrait." Edward swallowed. He knew the gravity in those words. "Yes, sir, I noticed a tilt, and your inspection logs are irregular." Pembroke interrupted, his tone calm but authoritative. "And there are whispers in the archives that restricted materials may have been accessed." "Care to explain?" Edward hesitated. The moral question pressed heavily. Honesty could ruin him. Concealment could be perilous if discovered. Elena stepped forward. "He found a letter," she said quietly, "from Queen Alexandra, addressed to a Charlotte, confidential, personal, preserved for over a century in secret." Lord Pembroke's eyes narrowed. "Charlotte?" Edward nodded. "It appears she was a granddaughter, sir, unacknowledged in official records." Pembroke's lips pressed into a thin line. Do you understand what this implies? Edward did. Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity demanded truth. Yes, that a branch of the royal line was erased from history. The comptroller exhaled slowly. Precisely, and for reasons we consider vital for the stability of the crown. Some histories, once unearthed, are dangerous. Knowledge is a weapon when misused. Elena's hand rested lightly on Edward's arm. "We are not here to misuse history," she said. Pembroke's gaze shifted between them, cold but calculating. Intent is irrelevant when the potential for disruption exists. Consider this a warning. Certain doors, once opened, invite scrutiny, and scrutiny is rarely forgiving. Edward nodded, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against him. He understood that the choice before him was no longer academic. He could follow protocol and surrender the letters, or he could preserve the secrets entrusted to him, knowing full well the consequences of either path. He looked at Elena. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a spark of determination, the same resolve that must have guided generations of the household staff before her. In that moment, Edward understood that Charlotte's story was not merely a tale of erasure, it was a test of duty, of courage, and of conscience. The storm outside began to rumble faintly, clouds swirling over the Berkshire hills as if echoing the turbulence within the walls. Edward took a deep breath. Whatever steps they took next, the course was no longer reversible. He turned back to the folder, fingers brushing the lavender seal. It was more than paper. It was a key, a bridge between what had been hidden and what might finally be understood. And he knew that once the next envelope was found hidden beneath the portrait, waiting, the story of Charlotte, the heir who never was, would begin to unfold fully. As Edward and Elena leave the office, Lord Pembroke watches from the shadows, calculating, patient, aware that some truths are dangerous even when kept in silence. Meanwhile, a sudden storm lashes Windsor's northern wing, and in the West Gallery, the frame of Queen Alexandra's portrait seems to shift imperceptibly, as if anticipating the discovery that lies beneath. The storm had arrived in full force by evening, rain streaking the castle windows, wind rattling the gallery shutters, and thunder rolling over the stone towers like a muted drumbeat of warning. Edward Thorne moved cautiously through the east wing, the folder secured in his coat. His pulse matched the storm, quick, uneven, aware of every shadow, every echo. He met Elena in the West Gallery, where the Queen's portrait hung, serene and imposing. The gilt frame gleamed under the dim gallery lights, her painted eyes catching the flashes of lightning outside. "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Elena asked, her voice low, almost lost in the sound of rain. Edward nodded. "I have to know what else is there." She hesitated, then reached for the frame. "Then we must be swift. The storm helps cover us, but it also brings risk. Anyone could be on the move tonight." Together they approached the portrait. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and old varnish. Elena produced a small set of delicate tools, brushes, and a micro spatula used for restoration. She moved with practiced precision, loosening the back panel of the frame. Edward's hands hovered over hers, steadying them. The panel shifted silently, revealing a hollow cavity. Dust drifted upward like tiny clouds, caught in the lamp's light, and there, nestled inside, were envelopes. Dozens of them yellowed with age, each sealed with lavender wax, each bearing the same elegant script. Edward reached for the first one, and a sharp crack of thunder made him flinch. The storm seemed almost alive, as if guarding the secrets inside. "Careful," Elena whispered. "Each one carries a piece of history, and of someone's life." He broke the first seal. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable, Alexandra's own, flowing and deliberate. A letter addressed to Charlotte, detailing instructions, sentiments, and warnings. "Look at this," Edward murmured, scanning the lines. She mentions other letters, hidden in case something happens. She anticipated that her plans might be disrupted. Eleanor's eyes softened. She protected Charlotte's existence even in secrecy, even from the crown itself. They continued, extracting letters one by one. Some contained detailed guidance about a private trust, instructions to ensure Charlotte's welfare, and subtle references to her education and placement in households trusted by the monarchy. Others were personal confessions, revealing Alexandra's sorrow at having to conceal her granddaughter, her regret at the lives erased for appearances, and her hope that someone would remember her. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but inside the gallery, a different storm unfolded, one of history, of truth, of moral reckoning. Edward paused on one letter. The handwriting was familiar, the words heavier. He read aloud softly, "If you are reading this, my dearest, then know that circumstances forced my silence. Your name must remain unspoken, yet your life is known to me. Trust only those who bear the memory as I do." Eleanor's breath caught. "This one mentions the Supplementary Heritage Register," she said. "She left a code, a path to verification, but it was destroyed after her death. They wanted this erased." Edward swallowed. Then all of this, the letters, the code, the trust, everything was meant to be invisible. "Yes," Eleanor said softly, "and yet, here it is. You found it." They continued through the cache, each letter revealing more. Alexandra had planned for Charlotte, but not for her to claim a throne, only a life acknowledged in private, protected by those willing to remember. Edward's hands shook slightly. The weight of centuries of secrecy bore down on him. He understood why Lord Pembroke had warned them. The knowledge could destabilize not just archives, but reputations, protocol, and perhaps even the narrative of the monarchy itself. And yet, he could not stop. By midnight, they had uncovered nearly every letter hidden behind the portrait. One envelope, however, remained at the very back, larger, more formal, sealed with the deepest shade of lavender. The wax bore Alexandra's initials, pressed carefully, deliberately. "This one," Eleanor said, her voice hushed, reverent. "I think this is the culmination, the final message." Edward nodded, hands trembling as he broke the seal. Inside was a letter of confession and instruction. Alexandra wrote not only of Charlotte's rights, but of her own hopes and regrets. She entrusted Edward, and by extension any who would discover the letters, with a moral imperative. Preserve her truth, protect her granddaughter's memory, and understand that duty often requires silence. Edward read aloud the closing lines. "Charlotte, though the world may forget your name, remember that love is stronger than decree, and those who guard it shall never be alone in conscience." He lowered the letter. Silence settled in the gallery. The storm had passed, leaving only the faint patter of dripping water. Outside, the castle's shadowed wings held secrets older than memory. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you see," she said, "we are not custodians merely of objects. We are custodians of truth, even when truth is inconvenient, even when it must remain unseen." Edward nodded, feeling the full weight of her words. He understood the choice that lay before him. The letters could change history if exposed. They could also protect it if preserved carefully, silently. The gallery seemed to sigh around them. The painted eyes of Alexandra's portrait calm once more, as though satisfied that her message had finally reached someone capable of understanding. Edward's mind raced, thinking of Lord Pembroke, the internal security logs, the paths of accountability. One misstep could undo everything. Yet another misstep could erase Charlotte entirely once more. Eleanor's voice broke the silence again. "We must decide together," she said. "Do we hand this over, or protect it?" Edward looked at the letters, at the meticulous care with which Alexandra had prepared them, at the human heart beating between each line. He felt the burden of history settle on his shoulders, heavy, profound, unrelenting. Outside, the first hints of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the west gallery filled with pale, filtered light, painting Alexandra's face in shades of gold and grey. The painted queen watched them silently, and for a moment Edward felt her presence. He made his decision not yet, for now the letters would remain, preserved, hidden, a truth safeguarded by the two who understood its gravity. And somewhere in the shadows of the castle, Lord Pembroke's watchful eyes had already noted anomalies in the gallery logs. The alert had been triggered. The investigation had begun. Edward and Elena had little time before their quiet guardianship became a test of courage, loyalty, and moral conviction. The storm outside had ended, but the storm within Windsor, the one of secrets, silence, and unacknowledged lives, was only beginning. As the first light of morning paints the gallery floor, Edward and Elena secure the letters once more behind the portrait. Outside, Windsor stirs, unaware of the century, old secret that now rests in cautious hands. And somewhere in the palace corridors, Lord Pembroke prepares to ensure that certain histories remain buried until the moment truth can no longer be denied. The castle lay shrouded in fog that morning, its towers reaching like silent sentinels into a sky the color of ash. Windsor was quiet, but the stillness carried weight, a tension that pressed against every stone, every gilded frame, every corridor. Edward Thorne moved carefully along the west wing. The letters, once hidden behind Queen Alexandra's portrait, now rested safely in his possession. Yet the knowledge they contained pressed on him more heavily than any physical object ever could. He paused before the portrait, his fingers brushing lightly over the gilt frame. The painted eyes seemed to follow him still, serene and silent, but imbued with a presence that was almost tangible. What would Charlotte have become had the world known her name? The question echoed through the gallery, mixing with the faint scent of lavender that lingered from the letters. Each envelope was more than ink and paper. It was a heartbeat from a past deliberately obscured, a life erased to preserve the illusion of order. Edward's reflection caught in the polished marble floor, and for a moment he saw not himself, but a man poised on the edge of history, deciding whether to uphold silence or reveal truth. Footsteps approached soft, deliberate. Lady Eleanor Kent emerged from the shadows of the corridor, her expression unreadable. "You're early," he said quietly. "I wanted to see the letters again," she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a measure of fear she did not attempt to hide. "We need to be certain what we're dealing with before anyone else notices." Edward nodded. He opened the folder slowly, taking care not to disturb the delicate wax seals. The letters were intact, though the faint scent of lavender had grown stronger, filling the room with a sense of both nostalgia and warning. "Look here," Elena said, pointing to a particular letter. Her gloved finger traced the words Alexandra had written to Charlotte. "Though they erase my hand from your life, remember that those who know will guard you. History may remain silent, but truth will live in memory." Edward's chest tightened. Guarding her in silence, is that duty or betrayal? Elena's gaze lingered on the letter, distant and contemplative. Sometimes the crown requires both. Silence preserves continuity. Exposure invites chaos. The weight of her words pressed on him. He thought of Lord Pembroke, the comptroller, who had already begun monitoring after hours' movements in the gallery. The man's eyes would see every misstep, every irregularity, every hint of discovery. Edward folded the letter carefully and replaced it in the folder. "And if we're discovered?" Elena did not answer immediately. She studied him instead, as if weighing his resolve. Then she said, quietly, "Then we do what we must to protect Charlotte's legacy and our own." The moral tension was palpable. The letters were proof of lives denied, truths silenced, and yet they were fragile, delicate, and at the mercy of those who held them. Hours passed as they reviewed each document, tracing Alexandra's handwriting, piecing together instructions, and noting references to guardians, adoptions, and discreet placements. Edward realized that the Queen had prepared for every contingency, even the possibility that her plans would be intercepted. The letters were not just communication, they were insurance against erasure. But their caution could not last forever. Surveillance in the castle had intensified since the logbook irregularities. Edward sensed it everywhere, the faint hum of security systems, the subtle changes in routine among staff, the invisible gaze of cameras monitoring hallways. Elena spoke again, her tone quiet but firm. "We are walking a thin line, Edward. One misstep and the Privy Council could seize these letters. They would suppress Charlotte's existence entirely and erase all evidence of what you have found." Edward nodded. "I understand, but how do we protect her life and honor the Queen's intent without being discovered?" Elena considered him for a long moment. "By being ghosts," she said finally, "invisible within the system, silent where we must be, and above all, unwavering in our discretion." The storm outside intensified, wind thrashing against the windows and rain slamming the gallery roof. The sound was almost a drumbeat, marking the passage of time, the inevitability of exposure. Suddenly, a soft sound, not thunder, not rain, but a click, faint and deliberate. Both Edward and Elena froze. "Did you hear that?" Edward whispered. Elena's hand went instinctively to the folder. "Someone is here," she said, or "Someone knows we've been here." They waited, listening to the storm and the distant echoes of the castle. Footsteps approached, deliberate, measured, each one heavy with authority. Edward's mind raced. Lord Pembroke, security. The consequences of discovery were immediate, unforgiving. A shadow appeared at the corridor's edge. The figure paused, then stepped into the dim light. It was not Pembroke, but a mid-level archivist, someone ordinary, someone who might have stumbled upon evidence of their nocturnal work. Edward exhaled slowly, relief mingled with tension. "We can't risk this," he whispered. "Even accidental discovery could alert higher authorities." Elena nodded. "Then we move quickly, secure the letters, hide the folder, restore the frame." Working silently, they replaced each envelope behind the portrait. The gilt frame seemed heavier this time, as if aware of the secrets it contained. They fastened the back panel carefully, making sure it aligned perfectly with the wall, leaving no trace of intrusion. The gallery now seemed calm again, yet both Edward and Elena felt the weight of what they had done. They had glimpsed a hidden lineage, a life erased, and a mother's quiet devotion preserved in paper and wax. As they moved toward the exit, Elena paused. Her hand rested on the portrait for a moment longer, almost reverently. "History may not remember Charlotte's name," she said softly, "but we will." Edward nodded. "And the Queen, Alexandra, she entrusted us," Elena replied. "Her voice will live only through those who honor her trust. We are the guardians now." Outside, the storm began to wane. The morning light penetrated the mist, casting long shadows across the gallery floor. The world continued unaware of the century-old secret that had briefly been exposed. Edward and Elena exited the gallery, each step deliberate, careful, measured. Behind them, the portrait seemed to watch silently, guarding its silent truth. In the distance, the faint echo of a bell sounded a reminder that time, like history, marches relentlessly forward. Edward glanced back once more at the portrait. The Queen's painted eyes seemed to hold a silent question, and for the first time he felt the full weight of the moral choice before him, to honor duty or reveal the truth. Elena's voice broke the silence. "We leave it for now, but the story isn't over." Edward nodded. Deep in the castle's shadowed corridors, unseen eyes were already stirring. The Privy Council, the Royal Comptroller, the mechanisms of power all poised to respond if the secret were discovered. And somewhere in the gallery, behind the serene visage of Queen Alexandra, the letters waited, silent, patient, eternal. As the sun rises over Windsor, the letters are hidden once again behind the portrait, their lavender seals intact. Yet surveillance has tightened, and Lord Pembroke's suspicion grows. Edward and Elena prepare for what is inevitable. The pursuit of these secrets will soon collide with power, authority, and the moral consequences of uncovering the heir who never was. The castle was cloaked in shadow as night fell, the halls silent but for the occasional drip of water from the storm-soaked roof. Edward moved cautiously along the northern corridor, the envelope containing Queen Alexandra's final letter pressed against his chest. The weight of it felt physical, a burden centuries in the making. Every step echoed in the empty hallways, a metronome marking the approach of consequences he could already feel closing in. Surveillance, logs, whispers, all were now instruments tuned to discover what should have remained unseen. He found Elena waiting in the private study, her expression guarded. The flickering candlelight cast long, uncertain shadows across the walls, highlighting her tense features. "They know something," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "The logs show irregularities. There's been talk among the staff. Lord Pembroke is aware." Edward's pulse quickened. "He'll come for the letters." Elena nodded. "If we are careless, yes, and we cannot underestimate him. He understands the consequences of history being rewritten." The room felt colder suddenly. The letters, fragile, yellowed with age, seemed to radiate the weight of their secrets. Edward gently removed the envelope, studying Alexandra's delicate script. "Listen." Elena continued, lowering her voice even further. The Queen's instructions were clear. Preserve the letters, guard the truth, and above all, do not let it fall into the wrong hands. We are the custodians now, whether we like it or not. Edward nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "And what if the wrong hands are already watching?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then we do what the Queen would have done herself, protect her granddaughter's legacy at any cost." The study grew quieter as they read through the letters once more. Alexandra's voice resonated from the delicate folds, her words both intimate and commanding. Each line revealed a hidden life, a granddaughter erased for the sake of continuity, a mother's sorrow tempered by duty. Edward's hands trembled as he traced the final letter. It spoke of trust, of care, and of hope that someone, someday, would honor Charlotte's existence. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them in place. The candles flickered violently as the shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. Edward and Elena exchanged a glance. "It's him," she whispered. "Pembroke." The door opened slowly. Lord Pembroke entered, his presence formal, commanding, and cold. His gaze swept across the room, taking in every detail, lingering briefly on the folder Edward held. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "I hear there's been irregular activity." Edward felt the tension spike in his chest. "Sir," he began cautiously, "the letters, they are private, intended only for someone who understands their significance." Pembroke's eyes narrowed. "And you believe yourself that someone?" "I believe we are preserving what history intended to protect," Elena said, her voice steady. "Nothing is being destroyed. Nothing is being misused. We are merely safeguarding the truth." Pembroke's lips pressed together, and for a moment the room seemed suspended in time. Then he spoke, measured and deliberate. "The Crown does not permit unauthorized custody of material that could undermine the monarchy. What you hold, what you protect, could destabilize the very order that has endured for centuries." Edward swallowed, sensing the enormity of the situation. "We are not seeking to destabilize. We only wish to honor Alexandra's intent." Pembroke's gaze hardened. "Intent matters little when the consequences are grave. Do you understand that by withholding these letters, you place yourself in direct conflict with the Privy Council?" Elena stepped forward, her tone unwavering. "We understand, but the letters do not belong to the Council. They belong to history and to Charlotte." A long silence followed, filled only by the quiet hum of the fire in the hearth and the distant echo of the storm outside. Pembroke studied them, calculating, assessing. Finally he spoke. "Very well. I will not confiscate them tonight. But mark my words, one misstep, one slip of discretion, and the consequences will be severe. The Crown cannot tolerate uncertainty." Edward exhaled slowly, relief mingled with apprehension. "Thank you, sir," he said carefully. Pembroke inclined his head slightly, then turned and left the room, his footsteps fading into the corridors. The tension he carried remained, a silent reminder of the ever-present threat. Elena let out a breath she had been holding. "We are running out of time," she said softly. "We must decide how to protect Charlotte's story while remaining unseen." Edward nodded. "And yet every day we wait, every day we hide, the letter's existence is a risk in itself." They returned to the portrait in the West Gallery. The envelope was carefully placed back behind the frame, aligned perfectly with the others. Each letter, each seal, now rested in a secret only they could guard. Edward traced the gilt edges lightly. "She trusted us," he whispered. "We cannot fail her." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the portrait. "History may demand silence, Edward, but the truth will always find a way to persist." They left the gallery together, footsteps quiet against the stone floors. The storm had passed entirely, leaving only the faint patter of residual rain and the echo of their own heartbeat in the corridors. Outside, Windsor's towers were pale against the breaking dawn, the castle appearing calm and indifferent to the centuries of secrets it harbored. Edward understood fully now. Protecting Charlotte's existence was not merely an act of courage. It was a moral obligation, one that could demand every ounce of discretion and loyalty from those who held it. Somewhere in the palace, Lord Pembroke was already reviewing the logs, noting irregularities with precision. He would not rest, he never did. Edward and Elena, however, were resolute. The letters were safe for now, and the story of the heir who never was would continue to be preserved in the shadows, hidden from eyes that would not understand. The weight of centuries pressed upon them, and yet, within that pressure, there was a strange clarity. Duty, discretion, and conscience had converged into a single, unyielding purpose: to guard the legacy of a queen and the life she had sought to protect in secret. And as the first light of morning illuminated the gallery, the Queen's eyes seemed almost alive, silent witnesses to a truth that could not be erased. Edward and Elena leave the gallery, the letters hidden behind the portrait once more. Yet the Privy Council's reach grows, surveillance tightens, and the moral stakes deepen. A quiet meeting at Frogmore House is already being arranged, and Edward will soon face a confrontation that will test not only loyalty, but the very principles he has sworn to uphold. Weeks had passed since the stormy night in the West Gallery. Windsor's corridors had resumed their measured rhythm, yet Edward Thorne felt the undercurrent of tension every time he walked its halls. The letters remained hidden, sealed behind Queen Alexandra's portrait, their lavender scent faint but persistent, a reminder of truths preserved and promises kept. He moved toward St. James's Palace, summoned discreetly, the invitation delivered in formal silence. The walk from the carriage was quiet. No ceremonial fanfare, no flustered attendants. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that what awaited him was neither scandal nor punishment, but reckoning. Inside, he was met not by the stern face of the royal comptroller, nor by the Privy Council, but by a quiet adviser, aged and steady, whose presence radiated authority without the need for intimidation. "Mr. Thorne," the adviser said, voice calm, measured, "we are aware of your discoveries, and we are aware of your discretion." Edward bowed slightly. "Sir." His heart raced, though outwardly he remained composed. "Your actions," the adviser continued, "have not gone unnoticed, nor has the care with which you preserved the letters." Edward's throat tightened. He had feared censure, investigation, perhaps even termination. Instead, he felt the weight of acknowledgement and a responsibility heavier than any punishment could impose. The advisor gestured to a private study. "Please sit." Edward obeyed, the room quiet, warm, and dignified. The polished wood reflected soft lamplight. A single portrait of Queen Alexandra hung on the far wall, her eyes serene, knowing. The advisor's gaze softened as he spoke again. "The sovereign has been informed of the letters, of Charlotte's existence, of the Queen's intent, and it has been deemed that the truth carefully preserved, quietly understood, will remain entrusted to those capable of honoring it." Edward exhaled, a mixture of relief and humility flooding him. "I did only what I felt was right," he said. "You preserved history," the advisor said, "and in doing so, you honored the crown." Edward reached into his coat, his hand brushing against the folded envelope he had carried for weeks. "And Charlotte," he asked quietly, "does she remain forgotten?" The advisor inclined his head slightly. "Her existence is acknowledged privately within trusted circles. Alexandra's intentions were not for exposure, but for preservation. Some truths are too potent to be made public, yet too significant to be lost." Edward considered this. The moral balance was delicate: a mother's love, a sovereign's foresight, a life erased for the sake of continuity. He thought of the letters themselves, of Alexandra's delicate hand, the lavender seal, the care with which she had prepared them to survive time and bureaucracy alike. "Your next duty," the advisor continued, "is to restore the portrait to its exact state, as it has been for over a century. The letters are to remain within, preserved, sealed, and respected." Edward nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the task. To touch the frame, to seal the letters, was not an act of concealment, it was an act of loyalty, of history safeguarded. He opened the cabinet beside the portrait, retrieved the letters, and studied the final page. Alexandra's handwriting was delicate yet resolute. "My dearest, though the world may not know your name, I trust that one day gentler hands will honor our story. Until then, remain unseen, yet remembered. Love endures where recognition fails." Edward traced the words lightly, feeling the weight of her intent, the depth of her care, the quiet defiance embedded in the act of hiding her truth. He lifted the envelope, aligned it carefully within the back of the portrait frame, and pressed the panel into place. The frame seemed heavier this time, as if aware of the secrets it now bore. The letters were sealed once again, but not lost. They were preserved silent, dignified, and waiting for those who could understand. The advisor observed silently, "You may leave once this is done. No record will be made of your actions beyond this room. Your discretion is your legacy." Edward stepped back, studying the portrait one last time. Alexandra's eyes seemed to watch him, approving yet solemn. He understood now that the Queen's true intention had never been for public recognition, but for preservation of dignity, love, and continuity. The weight of centuries settled into silence. The past had spoken, and Edward had listened. Outside the gallery, the palace hummed quietly with routine. Guards patrolled, chandeliers glimmered, and history carried on unchanged to the public eye, yet profoundly altered for those who understood its depth. Edward left the room with measured steps, feeling both the relief and burden of his responsibility. The letters were safe, the Queen's trust honored, and a hidden lineage, though unacknowledged, had been preserved. As he walked through the palace corridors, he realized that the story he had uncovered was not one of scandal nor rebellion, but of quiet courage, of duty intertwined with love. The crown had survived, and so had Charlotte, in memory, in protection, and in the delicate care of those willing to guard her secret. As Edward reseals the portrait, the lavender letters once more hidden behind the gilt frame, he leaves a subtle mark invisible to all but those who know to look. A silent promise that the Queen's truth, though concealed, has been acknowledged and preserved. And in the quiet palace, shadows stir. The legacy of Alexandra and the heir she sought to protect will continue, unseen but never forgotten. The final seal clicked into place, faint and deliberate. The portrait's frame felt heavier than ever, burdened not with canvas alone, but with a century of secrets, of love, loss, and hidden lineage. Edward stepped back, letting the letters rest in silence, their lavender scent faint but persistent, a reminder that what is hidden can still endure. He ran his fingers lightly along the gilt edges, noticing the delicate engravings, the way light danced across the carved flourishes. In that moment, he understood the full weight of Alexandra's intention: preservation, not exposure; dignity, not vindication. The advisor who had guided him earlier remained silent, a subtle affirmation of Edward's understanding. No words were needed. The gravity of the act spoke for itself. Edward lingered, reading the final page one last time. Alexandra's script, elegant and deliberate, conveyed more than instruction. It conveyed hope, regret, and love. My dearest, remember that truth can endure even when hidden. Those who guard it bear a responsibility heavier than public acknowledgement. Preserve with care and let your conscience guide your choices. He folded the letter gently, aligning it with the others behind the frame. Each one was a heartbeat, a voice from the past preserved in delicate, silent defiance. As he straightened, he realized the moral clarity of Alexandra's design. The letters were never intended for exposure. Their value was in quiet preservation, in the protection of dignity and legacy. Public knowledge could have destroyed Charlotte, or worse, distorted her memory. Duty had demanded silence, and in silence there was strength. Edward left the gallery slowly, each step echoing softly on the polished floors. The palace, bathed in early morning light, seemed ordinary to any outsider, but he carried within him the profound awareness of extraordinary history safeguarded. In the corridors, the air was quiet. Servants moved with routine precision. The sovereign's day proceeded uninterrupted. The world outside knew nothing of the heir who never was, and perhaps that was precisely how it should be. He paused at a corner, touching the subtle mark he had left on the back of the frame, invisible to all but those who knew to look. A silent promise, a whisper of conscience. History had been heard. History had been honored. Elena met him at the exit. Her expression was calm, though her eyes reflected the shared understanding of the moral burden they now carried. "It is done," Edward said quietly. She nodded. Preserved, not exposed. Alexandra's intention fulfilled. He looked at her, seeing in her face the same sense of reverence, the same acknowledgement that duty had guided them more than curiosity ever could. Outside, the palace grounds were serene, bathed in soft sunlight. The gardens, the fountains, the cobbled walkways all appeared untouched by the centuries of secret histories that pulsed quietly within the walls. Edward inhaled deeply. He understood now that the most profound truths are not always the ones the world sees. Some legacies endure only through those willing to protect them in silence. He turned once more toward the West Gallery. The portrait of Queen Alexandra hung precisely as it had for decades, perfectly aligned. Untouched, yet within its frame, the letters, the heartbeat of a queen, a mother, a hidden heir waited, silent, eternal. Edward's steps carried him out of St. James's Palace, the weight of what he had preserved settling into quiet dignity. He had fulfilled his duty. The crown had survived its reckoning, and the heir who never was had been honored, if quietly. He paused at the palace gates, looking back one final time. The painting seemed to glimmer softly in the morning light, the eyes of Alexandra almost alive in their stillness. Edward smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and understanding. Some truths are too potent to be displayed, yet too significant to be forgotten. Some legacies are preserved not through exposure, but through those who choose to guard them with care, discretion, and conscience. And in that quiet choice, Edward knew the crown, the queen, and Charlotte herself had been served. As Edward walks away from the palace, the portrait remains untouched, its frame hiding the lavender, sealed letters. The weight of duty, loyalty, and silent preservation lingers, a truth understood, honored, and kept, awaiting the hands capable of guarding it in the centuries to come. The corridors of Windsor were quiet now, empty, but for the occasional echo of distant footsteps. Edward Thorne walked slowly, his mind tracing the weeks that had passed, the storm, the letters, the portrait, the weight of history pressing on every decision. He paused briefly in the West Gallery. The gilt frame of Queen Alexandra's portrait gleamed softly in the morning light. From a distance it appeared unchanged, perfectly aligned, untouched, yet inside the lavender, sealed letters rested a hidden heartbeat, preserved across a century. Edward inhaled deeply, letting the scent of lavender fill his senses. It was faint now, a whisper of the past, carrying with it the intimacy of a mother's love, the foresight of a queen, and the fragile life of a granddaughter erased from history. He reflected on the choices they had made. The moral tension had been sharp, almost unbearable at times, duty versus truth, silence versus disclosure, loyalty versus conscience. Every step, every decision had demanded courage and discernment. Eleanor had left before dawn, returning to her work with the royal household, her expression calm but thoughtful. Edward remained alone, contemplating the implications of what they had preserved. It was not merely letters or a secret lineage. It was a lesson, one that transcended the specifics of monarchy and history. Some truths, though vital, are too fragile, too dangerous, or too disruptive to be exposed. The act of guarding them, of holding them in quiet fidelity, can carry as much moral weight as revealing them. He thought of Charlotte, the heir who never was. Her life, unacknowledged publicly, had been preserved nonetheless. Alexandra had written not for acclaim, not for the record, but for the conscience of those willing to protect her legacy. Edward now understood that duty is often silent, and love often invisible. As he walked through the gallery, the soft echo of his footsteps reminded him that history is not only written in books and archives. History lives in those who remember, in those who choose discretion over recognition, in those who honor legacy even when the world is unaware. Edward reached the doors that led to the palace gardens. Outside, the morning sun painted the stone pathways in gentle gold. Birds stirred in the hedges. Life moved forward, ordinary, unknowing, as it always had. Yet within the palace walls, a hidden truth pulsed quietly, safeguarded by conscience and care. He paused to look back at the portrait once more. Alexandra's painted eyes seemed almost alive in the soft light, serene and knowing. The frame bore no hint of its hidden contents, yet Edward felt the weight of what it held. The letters, the lavender seals, the century-old secrets, and the life they preserved rested safely, unseen by most, remembered by few. A sense of peace settled over him. The crown had endured its trial, and so had Charlotte's story, preserved quietly within the frame. Edward realized that sometimes the noblest acts of courage are those performed in silence, with no audience and no reward. He closed the gallery doors gently behind him. The echo of the latch was soft, almost respectful, as if acknowledging the gravity of what lay within. The past had been honored, and the present allowed to continue without disruption. Edward walked through the gardens, sunlight warming his face, and thought of Eleanor. Together, they had chosen preservation over exposure, discretion over curiosity, loyalty over personal recognition. In that choice, they had carried forward the intent of a queen whose wisdom extended beyond her own lifetime. History, he understood, is not merely a record of events, but a living testament to those who safeguard it. The crown, the letters, and the hidden heir all would continue, unacknowledged by the public eye, yet preserved for the generations who could understand their significance. The wind carried a faint scent of lavender across the gardens, as if Alexandra herself had left a trace for those who knew how to perceive it. Edward inhaled it, allowing it to fill him with the quiet resolve that he had acted rightly, that the truth, though silent, had been honored. For Edward, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the power of a legacy lies not in revelation, but in careful guardianship. Silence, when chosen with conscience and integrity, can be a language more profound than words, more enduring than public recognition. And as he walked further into the sunlight, leaving the palace and its secrets behind, he knew that the letters, the portrait, and the hidden life of Charlotte would remain safe, eternal in their quiet dignity. The portrait in the gallery remains perfectly aligned, its lavender, sealed letters hidden from view. Yet within its frame, a queen's voice, a mother's love, and a legacy preserved in silence continue to endure, whispering to those who choose to guard history with care. Edward walked slowly through the gardens, the palace fading behind him. Each step seemed lighter now, though the weight of what he had carried lingered in his mind, in his conscience, in the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat. The letters were hidden, the portrait was restored, yet their significance remained alive in his memory, vibrant as any spoken history. Alexandra's voice, delicate and unwavering, had endured through paper, ink, and time, and now through those who had chosen to honor her intent. He paused by the fountain, water catching the morning light in a prism of fleeting color. The gentle ripple reminded him that history, like water, moves quietly but persistently. What is hidden may appear still, yet it carries life within it, unseen currents shaping the future. Edward thought of Charlotte. Her life had been erased from public records, yet preserved in silence. Alexandra had trusted her granddaughter to the judgment of those capable of understanding, and Edward, along with Eleanor, had fulfilled that trust. The moral clarity of the moment struck him profoundly. The act of guarding truth, of protecting a hidden legacy, is a form of courage not often acknowledged. It does not seek applause, yet it requires every ounce of integrity. To bear witness in secret, to honor a life unseen, is itself a profound form of service. He ran a hand along the iron railing of the garden path, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. Duty, discretion, and conscience, these had been his guides. The crown had not been endangered, the legacy had been preserved, and the history that mattered had been honored. Edward's gaze drifted to the west gallery in the distance. He could almost see Alexandra's eyes in the portrait, serene, knowing, and patient. The letters rested behind the frame, invisible to all but those who knew their significance. Their silence was their power. A soft breeze stirred the gardens, carrying with it the faintest trace of lavender. Edward inhaled, allowing the scent to remind him that some truths endure without recognition. Some stories survive not through exposure, but through careful stewardship. He understood now that history is not merely what is written in books or recorded in archives. History lives in the hearts of those who choose to honor it quietly. The crown, the letters, and Charlotte's life were safe preserved in dignity, in discretion, in moral fidelity. Edward continued walking, each step measured, deliberate. He left Windsor behind, yet he carried the knowledge of the heir who never was, the letters sealed with lavender wax, and the Queen's quiet, unyielding intention. He thought of Eleanor, of the choices they had made together, and of the trust Alexandra had placed in them. Duty had demanded silence, yet in that silence there was profound purpose. The moral weight of history had been borne carefully, honorably, and completely. As Edward reached the edge of the palace grounds, the first light of dawn illuminated the portrait in the distance. From afar, it seemed unchanged, ordinary, untouchable. Yet within its frame, history, truth, and love persisted quietly, eternally. He paused one final time, feeling the resonance of the moment. Alexandra's legacy would endure. Charlotte's life, though hidden, would remain protected, and the act of preservation itself would echo far beyond the reach of public knowledge, beyond recognition, into the enduring language of conscience and duty. Edward turned and walked away, leaving the palace, the gallery, and the portrait behind. The letters were safe, history was honoured, and in silence the crown's true language had been preserved. The West Gallery remained still, its portrait flawless, its letters hidden from view. Yet, within the frame, the heartbeat of a queen, the memory of an heir, and the quiet choice of those who guard history endure forever. Some truths survive not through exposure, but through the hands willing to honor them in silence.